Um, Hello, everyone, once again, and welcome to Academic Presents Perspectives on Policing in India with Dr. Lokanita and Dr. Borvankar. So, before we begin, I just wanted to talk about Academicish and what we do and what our initiative is. So, we started in May 2020, and it's a joint venture between Rujita, who's an anthropologist, and me, who's an urban policy researcher. And this is our attempt at making academia contextual as well as accessible for people who are interested in discussing these things, but are not necessarily professionally engaged with this or don't know where to begin. So our attempt is to contextualize academic discourse in issues and works from the global south, because we've always felt that Western theories and Western works sort of dominate mainstream discourse. So this is just our attempt at correcting this imbalance. And in that context, we have monthly thematics where we have covered issues from labor to health to art and visual culture to urban spaces, and just recently this month, crime and justice. And we hold weekly discussions every Sunday, and you're welcome to join us. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter, or write to us if you want to be included in the mailing list. The details are in the chat. So moving on to why we organized this event and why we wanted to do this. So our monthly theme, as I mentioned, was crime and justice. And so both Rusta and me, we come from police families. So not only do we have a personal stake in this, but we've also realized that having these conversations with people, that most people don't know the details of how these systems function and the nitty-gritties of this. And so we thought that having a conversation with someone who's a practitioner, someone from inside of the system, as well as someone who's a researcher and who has extensive experience studying the system, could be a good place to begin. And as we also know, policing in India is something that's a very relevant issue, especially in these current times. So we thought that this platform would be a good way to examine all the different points of view and perspectives of this particular issue. So yeah, Rishta, if you can just introduce our panelists and we can begin.
Yes. Hello. So our first panelist is Dr. Miran Chadha Bolwankar, who is a retired IPS officer. She was the first woman to be an IPS officer in the Maharashtra cadre. She has also held several important positions over the course of her career, including DG Bureau of Police Research and Development, Commissioner of Police Pune, Chief of Crime Branch Mumbai, Chief of Maharashtra Prisons Department, to name a few. She has completed her doctorate on organizational management as well as a Bachelor of Law from the University of Pune. Dr. Bolwankar has written several articles in national and international journals, as well as research reports on investigation, gender, law enforcement, e-governance, and community participation. Dr. Bolwankar, we're really delighted to have you join us today.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Dr. Jeannie Lokanita. She's the chair and oh, okay. She's not the first. She's the second in Maharashtra. In fact, Dr. Borvankar. Sorry, our bad. All right. Moving on. Dr. Jeannie Lokanita is the chair and professor of political science and international relations at Drew University, New Jersey, USA. Her areas of interest include law and violence, political theory, under which she looks at post-colonial, feminist, and Marxist theory, transnational law, jurisprudence, and cultural studies. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California, prior to which she taught political science at Kirori College at Delhi University. She's the author of Transnational Torture, Law, Violence, and State Power in the United States and India. Her most recent book, The Truth Machines, Policing, Violence, and Scientific Interrogations in India, theorizes the relationship between state power and legal violence by focusing on the intersection of law, science, and policing through a study of forensic techniques such as narco-analysis, brain scans, and lie detectors. Dr. Lokanita, we're really glad to have you join us today as well. Also, given that it's really early where you are, relatively early in the morning where you are. So I'm going to be addressing the attendees now. The plan for the session is such that Sanjay and I have a few questions that we have gathered or we have framed over the course of our Crime and Justice Month, as well as in response to recent events in India as well as abroad, which we will be posing to our panelists, either to both or to one, and they're free to address them. Towards the end of the session, we will be taking questions from the attendees. So if in case you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them down in the chat box, which we will be monitoring. We request the attendees to kindly keep themselves on mute so that we don't have background noises. Let's get right into it. Sanchi will be beginning with the first part.
Okay. So right off the bat, we wanted to get into we wanted the panelists to address this recent burgeoning of anti-police sentiment that we've been observing. And we wanted to know what you make of it and how do you contextualize it in your specific experience and with your expertise. And this is a question that's open to both the panelists.
In terms of who starts. I can start off if that's okay with.
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for just setting this up, and also such a great idea. I love the term, just the name of your group, Academish. It's a reminder to all academics that how does one sort of create moments of conversations across different contexts beyond the world of academia. And of course, that's a constant challenge. So thank you for doing this, and I look forward to the conversation. So I think, when I think about this question, I sort of want us to maybe reframe it a little bit and sort of think about, what is the role of the police as imagined? And one of the very interesting things that, I found in my recent research is that there was a 97 Gore committee report that sort of looked at what is it that, how does one define the role of the police? And one of the things that they sort of talked about, and this was still early on, right, was to sort of think about how when we think about the police, they're really one of the most visible symbol of the authority of the state, right? And so there was this idea that they must act as a responsible public official, which according to them was defined as sort of this idea that they are supposed to safeguard and foster the process of socioeconomic growth and development and ensuring social justice. That's sort of the framework that was put forward. And when you're thinking about social justice, it of course immediately brings up whether the rights of the socially and economically marginalized, how are they being treated by the police as the most visible state official? So, when you think about that criteria and think about what are the, let's say, the 2-3 different ways in which we've seen the role of the police in the last 3 months, right? Or during the course of the pandemic, to my mind, as somebody who works on sort of the question of violence within, or state violence within democracies, the 3 things that come to my mind are the Jairaj Benix case in Tamil Nadu, right? The custodial death and sort of the brutalization of these 2 men in custody, right? I think about the, millions of migrants who were on their way home during a pandemic, and the kind of everyday enforcement by the police, right, in that particular context. And finally, I, sort of think about sort of the idea of how activists and people who are sort of using their basic rights under the Constitution have been treated, right? So when I look at these 3 main, roles of the police that sort of place that are in contradiction with what we expect to be the role of the police. So I think you have to contextualize this conversation, not in terms of sort of an anti-police sentiment, but think about what is the expected role of the police and what has been the visible ways in which the role has been articulated or seen or experienced by those who are the most marginalized in society.
Sanchi, would you reframe your question?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, Dr. Borwankar, could you repeat your question?
I wanted you to repeat it since Jeannie has responded. She reframed it. So what was your original question?
Yes, sorry. So our original question was, in recent past, there has been a burgeoning of anti-police sentiment. So how would you contextualize that, and what would you make of it with your experience and with your expertise?
So I'll take from Jeannie, while thanking both of you for this discussion forum, and you're inviting me. Jeannie mentioned 3 episodes which are in front of her when she's putting police or law enforcement in a perspective, which is your title for today's discussion. Now, I'm a police officer by profession, but I don't have any bias either in favor or against. So in fact, Jeannie has given me a very good foothold. See, you can think of 330 or even 300 episodes, but what about 30 lakhs issues being attended by police persons in India every day? So there is a case of violence here. There is a case of forced cremation there. There is a case of late registration of an FIR or non-registration. But the basic work for which police is commissioned, that is investigation of crime, maintenance of law and order, and later on now we also have security, internal security, and implementation of social laws. So though our original mandate was investigation of crime and maintenance of law and order, it was broadened. And every day 20 lakh police persons are, say, even if you say 1 hour interaction per issue, we can take out very few where maybe we failed to respond, we did not respond properly, we failed miserably, we did not rise to the occasion. But I would request the participants today, the audience today, to think of and to contextualize within a very broad framework where each constable, each sub-inspector, each officer is interacting with so many citizens per day. And then these episodes, don't take them in isolation and comment about the whole range of policing based on these instances where we have erred. So what is happening is that citizens are talking of us, even media is talking of us, where we have erred. But 95 to 97% of cases where we have responded in time, where we are documenting as mandated, where we are investigating as per CRPC, those are being ignored. So I would say in the whole scenario, don't contextualize police working on the basis of these isolated instances where we have failed to rise to the occasion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Borwankar, for putting that into perspective. Our next question is also related to this. And so the recent case, the Hathras case in UP, and we've all been following the developments and the actions of the police in that particular instance. So, Dr. Borwankar, this is a question that maybe you can address. Do you think, is this a localized issue or is this a systemic problem? And this case is also unique because there are certain caste dynamics at play here. So how does that exactly play out in policing in such cases? So if you could respond to this.
So gender is an issue all over the country. Caste is an issue. I can say that both of these are not issues, but they are very relevant issues, and relevant and pertinent, and maybe more so in rural India. In urban areas, I would say both caste and gender are still issues, but not to the extent to which we have it in rural India, and also middle class and above. Caste and gender do not matter and are responded to better by police. And I feel in urban areas also, the marginalized section, the slum dwellers, the poor below poverty line, for them, caste and gender exist for police even in urban areas. This is the sad truth, and therefore Hathras came into media being discussed, but I would say that there are many such instances where police either does not register or registers such cases late, and maybe investigation is also not up to the mark, because NCRB data shows that offences against women, even conviction rate is not beyond 30%. So I would say gender, caste, rural, urban, poor and non-poor. These issues are definitely there.
So, Dr. Borwankar, just to follow up, then, so when we've seen cases of police being violent or vindictive, so is this an issue of the individual in question that is violent, or is it a system that enables them to? And we can also say this in the context of cases such as the Delhi riots or the Hyderabad encounters. How would you respond to that?
Mostly it's the individual, because institutionally, from training and refresher courses, from culture point of view, it has been reiterated by training workshops, by leaderships, that torture, third degree violence, these are not acceptable. But some individuals do take a chance, one. And sometimes institution backs this, like the Hyderabad case, the Dubey encounter case. In few instances, I have seen that institution, not even institution, even society, in both the cases, in Hyderabad Dubey case, there is a silent consent from the society. But this kind of consent and institutionalization is much lesser today than it was when I joined service in 1981. So we are progressing, and these individual aberrations apart, the institution is definitely giving a message that it's scientific investigation, it's human rights, and it's gender respect. That we are 100% successful, I'm not saying that, but the institution is definitely giving a message of change.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing your insights. Dr. Lokanitha, I want to put this to you. So we've been talking about flaws in the system. We've been talking about the prejudices that individuals hold and the biases that they hold. So would you say then that technology is something that we can turn into that is dependable, that is free of bias, that will correct all the wrongs that have been happening?
So I do want to go back to the question of Hathras, because, I think that's sort of really been impacting all of us. right? As we are reading about it every single day. So let me start there and, then maybe come to the question of scientific technology, right? I think, the fact that caste and gender, and we can talk about other sort of societal hierarchies as well, are central to, how Indian politics, society, and therefore all institutions, including the police, function, can actually be traced to what happened in Hathras, right? So I definitely, do not see that as an individual instance, right? If you just look at the patterns of, sort of rapes and sexual violence against women, but also Dalit women in particular. I think there's a long history of Dalit women's bodies being targeted in order to make it an example of terror for entire Dalit communities is very central to the story, right? It is one other instance of that. It's a part of a pattern where Dalits in UP have been, particularly focused as a way of showing caste superiority by Thakurs, but also other upper castes. And one thing that I'll say is that as a result of that, right, there UP has also seen a lot of anti-caste movements, right? And so, some of this also has to be seen in that particular context, meaning that basically it's a way to constantly push against assertion by Dalits and those who have been consistently targeted. And here the role of the police becomes extremely important, right? So because in Hathras, you basically see sort of an articulation of some of the issues that actually Dr. Borvankar was talking about, right? Sort of the kind of cremation of the, body without the family's consent, right? In the middle of the night. Even as investigations are going on, you sort of have to ask this question about, what is it that prompts these kinds of actions again and again? And that is not the first time. Would it have happened if it was not a Dalit family? Could the police have controlled the situation the way that they did? So that's a big question, right? And then to Sanchi, to come back to your question about whether scientific technology is something, which can be seen as a kind of a response, is something that has to be understood in terms of how do we think about the question of, scientific technologies, right? So when I sort of think about the work that I've done based on interviews with forensic psychologists, lawyers, police, and activists, right? One of the things that you realize is that you don't look at debates on validity or reliability of science, right? But you sort of bring in sort of anything that is functioning as science as if it's going to be the solution, that is going to take care of all the problems, right? So narco-analysis was brought in almost as if, oh, this is the solution to third degree, even though all over the world that has been rejected as, unreliable, right? And you can extend it to other kinds of forensic evidence as well, which again, you have to sort of think about how is it that expertise and science are coming into this particular question. I can elaborate on this, but I also want to, make sure that, if there are follow-up questions, I can deal with that.
So we're going to go in a slightly different direction, since we are talking about perception and we are talking about how the police or how these institutions are perceived. And we don't think that a discussion on policing in India can really be complete without talking about how they are represented in popular culture. So to give, say, a recent example of any movie from the Rohit Shetty police universe, if it's like a Simba or a Singham or any of these, what we often see is that the image of the police is of someone who is macho, hyper masculine, aggressive. And this question is first to Dr. Borwankar. As someone who has been in this force, as a woman also, how do you think this image that we create in society of police being masculine or macho or aggressive, how does that affect the women in the force? How does it affect, say, their interaction with their bosses, their colleagues, female crime suspects for that matter? How do we understand this effect?
I can see this journey in my batch of 1981 Indian Police Service. See, I was the only woman officer. And when I joined Maharashtra, I was the second one. So we were looked upon as, some non-serious kind of entities, and officers would wonder, not only officers, their wives would also wonder that how are we going to cope? What will happen to us once we start family? And we were, at least I was equally uncomfortable. I really didn't know. I wanted to join police, and I joined police because I was in awe of my father's uniform, who was in Punjab Police and later on in BSF. I would be alone in my batch, and there'll be such few women. It hadn't bothered me initially, but later on I realized that I had no role model to follow. Now that is 80s, and now in 2020, we are in the process of inducting 30% women in police all over India in different police organizations. And today I think Maharashtra has around 11%, and all India would be about 9% women. So wherever there are few women, they try to act and behave like men, because that male culture is so strong that we get sucked in. But wherever the number of women is increasing, and even if they are few, but they are later generation, say 2010 onwards, they are very confident and they are very serious about the jobs. We have a Center for Police Research in Pune, which had commissioned a study which I undertook along with the Pune University Psychology Department. We had a sample of 450 women constables and women sub-inspectors with service of 5 to 10 years, which means it was a younger lot. They emerged as confident, who said that the department is not doing enough for them to be gender friendly, and gender friendly was defined as work environment, gender respect, gender equality, and cooperation. So they were so confident that they ticked off the department being not gender friendly, and they specifically asked for leadership workshops, which was such a pleasant surprise that they wanted not just to be one amongst many. They wanted to now be in leadership positions. And even when I was Commissioner of Police Pune, women definitely wanted to be in charge of police stations, in charge of chowkis. So the macho male image, one is not considered good even for men now. See, I have mentioned earlier also, now the culture, police culture, though not fully changed, the message is scientific investigation, human rights, gender respect, and not that trigger happy, those movie, Salman Khan kind of movie kinds. So if the message is that, and since women in police are becoming more confident, I think after another, say, give 5 more years, their ratio will increase, and that image of a scientific police investigator, a professional law enforcer, would be the image which both men and women in police would project and would like to project. That old image has not gone out completely. One main reason is citizens also love that. I'll give you a small instance. When I became superintendent of police in Aurangabad, now during that period, 91, 92, we didn't have any communal issues. So I was like a regular district police chief, going to office in my car, coming back, doing my files, going for inspections. Citizens used to say in Marathi, "Arey, there you should have a pilot jeep in front of you. You should have gunners with you. You should be followed by a car or a jeep." So citizens also want some kind of, that gung-ho policeman. Even politician today would like to have 2-3 men in those black cats. One, because it gives them an ego kick. Second, Indian citizens also is in the trap of VIP culture and a very macho police officer. Both these images will slowly go away. We are work in progress.
Dr. Lokanitha, to address, I mean, we have a similar question for you also. You can obviously address the earlier question, but for you, we would look at the state as someone that adopts a sort of paternalistic approach to its citizens. So does the police as this masculine, hypermasculine character then fall in line with that approach that the state is adopting, or does it come from elsewhere? Yeah.
So thank you. So I think, again, I sort of feel like we need to contextualize what is happening in popular culture as well as sort of what I think is the police culture. So I will say that, some of both drawing upon my interviews as well as some of what we see in terms of figures, right, give a very different story, right, when we think about whether the police culture is actually changing. Unfortunately, you actually find that, if we go back to UP for a second, we have to sort of think about, what happened with Vikas Dubey in terms of the encounters that, the UP police themselves have said, right? I think they sort of proudly said that 124 alleged criminals were shot dead in 6,476 encounters. These are their own figures, right? 37% of them were Muslims, right? So let's also be very clear about who are sort of the people who get targeted. I talked about Dalits earlier, but we have to sort of think about how Muslims as a community have been targeted in the last few years in particular. And I think there was even a study by, and I'll mention 2 studies just to sort of point to the fact that we actually have very good sort of evidence of this, right? I think there was one that was done by DGPs themselves, including basically acknowledging that Muslims sort of feel that the police are discriminating against them. And then a Common Cause and CSDS survey last year actually showed the police basically admitting that they were biased against Muslims, against sort of Dalits. They did not believe women and Dalits about the violence that was done against them. So I think the reason why I constantly want to sort of bring back this question is because you often tend to think of it as individual bad apples. This is a tendency that is there in the US, all over the world, that, they're the individuals who are responsible, as opposed to recognizing that it is much more structural and institutional, and therefore, needs much more of a rethinking and reimagining than has been done so far, right? So I think, and I think one thing that I do agree is that there is sort of the popular culture which reinforces this idea a lot, right, of this hypermasculine, we'll do justice. Ab Tak Chappan is a good example of that, right? I mean, where you celebrate extrajudicial executions, which are illegal, right? But they are not an aberration. They've been celebrated, glorified, not, and how do we know that they are more institutional? Is because there is no accountability, right? For either torture or extrajudicial killings, which, and here we are just talking about UP and, sort of the more routine context. We haven't even talked about the conflict areas, which has a, much more sort of different regime of extraordinary laws that have allowed for torture and encounters. But just, if for now we just talk about the routine context, we actually find that popular culture has sort of reinforced that. And there are very few films that actually directly challenge it, right? So you can think about Visanarai, the Tamil film by Vetrimaran, right? Basically being one of the few films that actually exposes how torture targets, poor migrant workers, and basically is problematic. So I think one other thing on training, and we can come back to this. I think it's true that human rights training, and does exist at some levels, but you actually find that people who've studied that, sort of systematically, and here Rachel Wall has written a book on this, on training in Indian context, and where she finds that the police actually say, oh, you know what, we actually use torture for justice, right? And they're saying this directly, including in my own interviews, where they actually agree, that they use torture routinely because they need some kind of a way to show that they're doing some work. So we do have to ask these questions structurally and institutionally as well.
Right. So we are also, from both of your answers, we are looking at reforms of a certain scale. And this is something that I think when Sanchi and I started wanting to talk about the police, this is something we wanted to specifically talk about, the defund the police movement that is gaining traction in the US, and is largely talking about their heavily militarized civilian police also. And there have been similar calls in India. With so much work ahead of us in terms of reform, in terms of restructuring, Dr. Lokanitha, we'll ask you first. Do you think that defund the police, does it make sense in the Indian context if we were to take it as is?
So let me start by just saying a little bit about the US context, because that's where, both I teach and write about both contexts. And, obviously I'm based here. And the reason why, and it's not just defund the police, right? So the more radical sort of approaches asking for the abolition of the police, just as there's been a demand of abolishing of prisons, right, in the context of the US. And it comes from a very particular history, right? And I won't, obviously, we don't have time to go over that, but just to say that there's a colonial history to it, even in the context of the US. There's a slave patrol kind of a model that's also, seen in the way Blacks get particularly targeted in the current context, right? But more importantly, it's come out of a recognition that reform has failed, right? Basically, they've found that training has not been helpful, civilian review boards have not been that helpful, body cams have not been that helpful, right? Even representation, bringing in minorities, Blacks, women, has not changed the nature of the police force. And as you rightly said, there is a militarization, right? For everything you think about criminalizing, right? Even if it's drug use, if it's minor crimes, so on and so forth, right? So the demand for defunding and abolition is coming from a very clear analysis and focus on who is being targeted and why that model has taken away the way in which state has not fulfilled its basic necessities. So I would say that we do have to ask this question, right? So I remember when the Jairaj Bennick's case happened, right? That immediately sort of raises question about, is this a George Floyd moment in India? And, and I would love to hear more from all of you, who are based in India, to think about how you think about it. I would say that we have to ask this question: has reform made a change in the Indian context, right? We also have to think about, are the police able to work independently of the political powers, right? Why is it that, UP is seeing a particular role of the police than other places, right? We have to ask this question, right? Are there conditions in which the constabulary is there, right, versus the 1%, right, of the police force? How do we think about responsibility and accountability, right? And unless we ask these questions, we won't be able to ask the question about what should be the demand in the Indian context.
Yeah. So, Dr. Borwankar, we want to get to you in terms of the call to defund and the way it's been called for. Firstly, we need to know if it would be possible in the Indian context, but more importantly, like Dr. Lokanitha mentioned, the difference between the constabulary and the officers that exist, who would this defund or this cut, if it were to happen, hit first, and who are the people who would actually be likely to be affected by it the most? Also, would it serve the purpose? So the call for defund in the US is to hold the police accountable and to stop shielding them from the atrocities that they are committing against certain groups of citizens. So would it serve this purpose if it were to be enacted in India? Yeah.
I would say in India, in fact, we need more funding. See, the international ratio is, I think, 220 police persons per lakh. And in India, we have sanction strength of about 180, but working strength of only about 140. I was in Bureau of Police Research, so we studied last 10 years pattern. The average vacancies in every state was between 25 to 30%. So compared to international standards, we are already much below in police presence. And then by keeping these vacancies, we further bring the police citizens ratio not only low, but so low that every constable in India, irrespective of the state, is working 14 hours and 365. Now, as a Fulbright fellow, I was an intern with Minneapolis Police, where unfortunately this Floyd incident happened. And I interned with Minneapolis and St. Paul Police for 1 year each. And after 8 hours duty, the constable would just put his key and leave the desk and would work only if he is being given overtime. And in India, no overtime, no holidays, more work during festivals, and yet this poor ratio of citizen to police of about 40 be 120 per lakh. So I feel to compare India with US, because they are talking of defunding, it's become a popular term in India. It's extremely unfair, unjustified. And in fact, citizens should pressurize government and politicians to fill the vacancies, fund more technology, more officers-oriented policing. So by officer-oriented policing, I would explain that in India, we have more constables who are like errand persons. They will serve summons, warrants, they would bring this witness and they will draw a panchrama at recovery with the help, they will help the IO. So the main foundation of investigation is a sub-inspector and above in India, whose ratio is much lesser, and the bigger chunk is of constabulary, which does not take decisions, which is not even empowered to take decisions. So I would say fund Indian police more, bring more officers than constables, bring more technology and science, more infrastructure. So defunding is just not the issue in India, and let's not compare us with the US. I would give you one more example. So after putting his key, after putting in 8 hours, 40 hours in a week, the same officer will go and work as a bouncer in the next restaurant. In US, he does not need permission from his boss, from his department to take another job, which adds on to his salary. In India, we don't permit that. We are supposed to be, my constable and my DG are supposed to be on duty 24 hours. They cannot take any extra job. So for me, word like defunding is absolutely irrelevant in Indian context. And I would request your audience that in fact they should build pressure for more funding, more infrastructure, and more science and technology, forensic equipment for police.
So
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I do think that, you know, comparing different contexts is always a hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to historicize, right? What is a particular context. And I think I would agree that all studies show that a lot of the infrastructural conditions, particularly, and I want to emphasize this, that the lower ranks of the police, for the lower ranks of the police, are extremely difficult, and you know, they're not enough conditions of work, right? Absolutely right. I think it's very, and this is why I said that it's not just about defunding, but about abolition and sort of thinking about the role of the police, right? So I think, you know, one should think about the role of the police, considering the fact that there is clear evidence of discrimination. It is structural and institutional, and we have to find ways of ensuring accountability, right? Accountability is one of the biggest things that is going on in the US, in India, all over the world, where violence is not, is something that is illegal, right? The use of excessive force is illegal, but rarely gets accountability. And I don't think we have talked about accountability really, right, in this conversation. So we cannot talk about this without thinking about accountability is one I just want to inject back into our conversation.
Right.
Thank
you. So we're nearing the end of the questions that Sanjay and I had framed. After the next two questions, we will be taking questions from the participants. But we wanted to sort of get an idea of what do we look at? I mean, where do we go from here? So we will ask Dr. Borvankar first. At the moment, are there any reforms, police reforms in the works? And if there were to be, if we were to think of reforms, what would they look like? Because for a lot of people, the difficulty is, where do you even start with a system of this proportion, right? So if we were to start imagining reforms, or if there are reforms being enacted, how are they already happening, or where do we see them being enacted upon?
So the audience can refer to the Supreme Court mandated reforms of 2006. There are many earlier reports also, but these are easy to grasp. They are recent and they are in the process, though most states are very reluctant to implement. One major reform is that by establishing state commissions, policy making in law enforcement would be in the hands of not only ruling party, but also opposition, professionals, so that policy making through state police commissions is expected to become more professional. It would not have these kinds of unprofessional decisions of cremating a body at night, not allowing media enter a particular village just because ruling party has gone into a panic. So a state security commission. Then another reform which is very important is establishment boards, where officers are posted as unit heads on the basis of the merit and not because they are close to this politician and that member parliament is related to them or ruling party he or she favors. So by having a policy making a state and national level commission, by having establishment boards for giving postings on the basis of merit, Supreme Court expects some changes. And another very important, two more I would just mention so that our audience doesn't lose if I talk too many reforms. Separating law and order from investigation. See, as it is, the ratio of policeman to the citizens is low. Now the same officer who is investigating an important case of housebreaking, murder, is suddenly rushed to go and stand on chowk number X because the CM convoy is passing, or because the PM is visiting and opposing political parties may take out a rally. Now he leaves that investigation, rushes there, and again he comes back after 6 hours. No, I mean, after all of us are human beings. Our officers and men are just rushing from A to B to C place, and therefore they are not able to do justice to investigation. And they're also not able to respond in a professional and matured manner to law enforcement challenges. And therefore this panic. So one reform is that separate within a police station. In Mumbai, many police stations have done this. There is inspector law and order, there is inspector crime. They have this separate staff. And the fourth one, which I would take here, though there are 7 reforms, is police complaint authority. Like Lokneeta has said, that there should be accountability. Now people feel if a police officer is erring, reporting to his senior police officer may not get us an independent, unprejudiced report and action. Therefore, Supreme Court has recommended independent police complaint authority, which will hold erring officers responsible for their defaults. Now, again, I would like to bring it to the notice of the audience here. Many of you will not know. The only department with highest number of departmental inquiries followed by punishments is the police department. No other government department takes as much action as police does, but it's not talked of. So the 4 reforms, Rujita, which I want your audience to know is security commissions at the state level for policy making, establishment board for placing officers as unit heads on the basis of merit, separation of law and order and investigation, and independent complaint authorities to hold police accountable wherever they do not perform or they fail to perform.
Thank you so much, Dr. Borvankar. Dr. Lokneeta, as a social scientist and as someone who studies culture and society, we actually want to ask you that for any of these reforms to be actualized, what are some of the cultural or social changes that need to happen first for these to hold ground?
So, and I'll come to this in a second. I do want to add on to a couple of things that Dr. Borvankar already mentioned. I think the Prakash Singh case that she's talking about, I think is really important moment. Of course, it was in 2006, and today we are in 2020. And if you actually go back and, in my recent book, I actually do a sort of tracing of all the reform commissions. And one finds that some of these questions have been talked about for decades, right? And yet, of course, we are still talking about them. And I do agree that basically law and order and investigation, that has been a major demand, sort of differentiating between them. I think the question of political autonomy or political independence is an important one. It is always striking to see when a particular government is in power, right? What are the kind of ways in which the police functions. The two other things I would just want to mention, and this will actually bring me back to the question that you asked about society and culture, is that how do we sort of think about accountability in terms of ensuring it, right? So for instance, other than the Prakash Singh case, there's been an anti-torture bill that has been lying in the legislative process for a very long time. India is one of the few countries which has not ratified the UN Convention Against Torture. And we have to ask the question, why is it that that's not the case, right? We have a perfectly great, version of the bill, most recently by the Law Commission, which ensures command responsibility, has a very, sort of broad definition of torture in consonance with the UN Convention. And we have to ask the question, why is it that there's no, movement? Right? You're talking about, sort of copying, what is happening elsewhere. Then why isn't there a movement asking for an anti-torture bill? Partly because, you don't want accountability, right? There is a way in which, it would lead to accountability at all levels, right? And I think we have to ask that question. The second is, how do we treat critics and civil liberty activists and scholars, right, at this particular moment? And we are in the news constantly now, as you said, in the context of the Delhi riots, but there are numerous other cases under which those who have systematically done work in just being citizens and scholars and social scientists and journalists and poets, right, which is important in a thriving democracy, are the ones who are constantly being put in jails, right? And you have to ask the question, why is it that we are in this moment, right? And that's the question about society and culture, right? That why aren't, right, more people in India asking this question about, how are these cases being generated? How are sort of people being demonized, right? And these are all, things that actually emerge from your own questions, right? And one thing that I will say is that there is an acceptability, right, of excessive violence. In 2014, when a world survey was done, India topped alongside China in terms of basically accepting the use of torture, right? So I think it's also asking us to think about, how does one change the culture around this? And I didn't get a chance to talk about this, and we were focusing on the police. But I think when we are talking about the police, we also have to think about what is the role that judges are playing, the judiciary is playing, right? Is it enough just to have judgments? Is it not important to basically ensure that there's some kind of follow-up, right? What is the role that the scientific community is playing, and so on and so forth. So I think these are important questions that both help us focus on what is necessary for changing the police, but also leads to larger conversations.
Thank you so much. We will be taking some questions from the audience that have come up in the chat. So Sanchi will be asking the questions that came up in the first half. Sanchi, do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Dr. Borwankar, this is a question that maybe you can respond to. So Siddhant Gupta asked, Do you feel better police-community relationships can help reduce misconduct and the necessity of force and violence?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, the subject for my thesis was the same. I had a good sample of students and I also had a good sample of police officers. Now, police officers reported that they take help of community. They may not document it. It may not be very formal, but informally, from detection of crime to maintenance of law and order, the officers listed that they not only heavily depend on local citizens, but they also appreciate their collaboration. They mentioned that it's not, these channels are not very formal, except 2-3 they had mentioned Mahalla committees. My sample was from Maharashtra, Gram Suraksha Dals and Mahila Suraksha Samitis. So like these 3-4 emerged as formal collaboration. Students were equally vocal in seeking help of and collaborating with police. Here I would like to mention that we had started a program called Pune Police Vidyarthi Abhiyan, where we were giving internship to students, and students were very happy. In fact, girl students also said that some police stations were partial. They were taking male students for night rounds and they were not being taken. And we said, okay, we are fine if you want to join for night round. They were also taken for night rounds. Frankly, I had two observations. One, I realized that the enthusiasm of students was not reflected in the enthusiasm of officers who were delegating it to the interested officers and constabulary to guide the interns. And second, I felt, because they are already overworked, I have already discussed this point that all over the country, police is terribly overworked. One thought which I have, which I want to share frankly, is I feel because police as an institution, collaborating with citizens requires transparency, which many of us are resisting. But collaboration would increase our strength. In fact, informally also people joining us helps us. Our physical strength, manpower with the informal collaboration of citizens would increase. Our intelligence, local intelligence, what is happening where, then subsequently to handle the law and order challenges. And in the questionnaires, officers had said that most of the detections are based on tips received from citizens. So they themselves are accepting it. Two reasons which I feel collaboration in India is not successful is because officers are so overworked that they would reach out to citizens when they need them. Though they also, and many officers, to some extent I agree with them, citizens also reach out to police only when in crisis or emergency. And secondly, because of corruption, I feel this collaboration is not coming in a big way. But your audience, citizens, can help in police training. See, not only are we overworked, understaffed, every state gives 2% of its budget to police, and out of that, less than 1% of the budget which we get is spent on our training. So the immediate measure which anyone who has some kind of expertise can join hands with the police stations, with the local thanas, give inputs on stress management, on nutrition, on time management, and also then find out what is their requirement for training. that can be imparted. And Lokneeta has quoted this Common Cause report, which also says that only 6% of police officers and staff receive refreshers or in-service trainings. So citizens can contribute to this, adding to sharing their expertise through in-service training also.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure even I didn't know all these things. So this was a very great, this is very informative for all of us. The next question, Dr. Lokanita, you can take this. So this is by Mitsu Sahai. Referring to the encounters, these encounters provide a kind of catharsis to collective conscience, much like capital punishment. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so thank you. Let me also just add that I do think the overwork part is, and lack of funding for training is an important thing. I was shocked to hear that, there were no interrogation modules, for instance, until the 1990s. And one other thing I've been meaning to say is that I think it's also important to recognize that there are, many of these insights that ex-police officers or retired police officers themselves are giving into the institution of the police, and who look at their own role reflexively, is a really important resource. And that I found in my own research as well. And just to say that even in the Delhi riots case, we've had former police officers come out very strongly against the way in which investigations are done, and pointing to the political nature of, some of this targeting. So I do want to acknowledge that, it's not an undifferentiated sort of notion of the police that I'm sharing. So that's really, very important. So to come back to encounter and capital punishment, so the question that one has to ask, right? And I'm thinking about catharsis. What does it mean to have catharsis, right? Because when you think about a rule of law based constitutional democracy, which India, at least formally, right, that's sort of how it's sort of thought of, and one believes in what is written in the preamble, or is sort of talked about, then you have to ask the question that a basic premise of a legal system is to assume that a person is actually thought of as innocent until proven guilty, right? And part of the issue with particularly with encounters is that it totally takes away the basic premise, right? Because what do we know about encounters, right? Most of the time we find, and encounters have a long history in the Indian context, right? It's been done against alleged Maoists and Naxalites. It's been done against alleged, terrorists. It's been done against alleged organized criminals, and now rapists, alleged rapists, right? And the reason why it's one of the most dangerous practices is because it undermines the very foundation of a due process, right? So I think that the choice in front of us is to ask that who is the catharsis for? And is one willing to understand the implications of anybody being, being targeted? And most of the time, right, when you go to the other parallel, right? So if extrajudicials are illegal, right, even in the Indian context, capital punishment is legal in the rarest of rare cases. In that particular context, when you look at studies that have been done on death row in India, I'm not talking about other parts of the world which also show the same, it is primarily the poor, tribals, Dalits, who are actually talking about, and here I'll refer to a report by National Law University Delhi, which actually showed this, right, that majority were from the marginalized sections who were tortured, right? So if you have a system which primarily either focuses on just getting instant justice, ab tak chappan style, right? That's sort of the style, glorified, or it bypasses basic due process protections by forcible confessions and torture, then we have to question these two and look at it very carefully, because it undermines the foundations of rule of law based democracies. And for me, that's really important as somebody who thinks about what is it to mean to live in a democracy.
Thank you so much for raising those questions. Yeah, sorry, Rusta, you can go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that. And Alicia Dogra asks that some people argue that allowing citizens to sue the police is a positive legal step. I think either of you can respond to this. What do you think about this?
Even today you can sue a police person, but it requires sanction from the government. I won't say it will demotivate police persons, because government generally sanctions after applying its mind whether a case is made out or not for prosecution. I mean, like, I feel in cases where a clear-cut case is made out against a police officer, yes, why not? But this legal power exists today also. Don't misuse it, that is all. And I don't think in India many people think of misusing this power. In fact, they are that way more benign. They are even ready to overlook some issues. This already exists, but suing an officer for an act which he or she performed during the course of her duty, his duty, requires sanction from the state government for state police officers, and from Government of India for the officers working for Government of India. This permission is given, sanction to prosecute, after proper inquiry is made. And if any act of a police officer is done in his or her individual capacity, like if I commit an body offense, if I steal, then you don't need any permission. You can just go ahead and register a case. But for doing an act during the course of my duty, you require either the permission from the Government of India or from the state government.
Dr. Lokanitha, do you want to
Yes, absolutely.
respond?
I think this is one of the key issues that anybody who's working on human rights in India is very concerned about. I think, I would just say a couple of things. One, prosecutions have been extremely rare in the Indian context as far as torture and custodial deaths are concerned. There are available data both from NCRB as well as National Human Rights Commissions, in addition to the huge literature we have from the civil liberty and democratic rights groups from all over. It's only when groups push a case, right, that there is some possibility of, some action being initiated, right? And the sanction provision, I think, is the biggest hurdle in getting accountability. This is something I should have mentioned earlier. The new torture bill sort of redefines the question of sanction in a big way. And that's one of the reasons, at least the police who talk to me sort of are not so much in favor of that, right? And I think there's a way in which, compensation, right? So of course, when we are thinking about what is the way in which people who get tortured are given some kind of restitution, sometimes compensation is given, right? But you have to sort of think about, if you don't get prosecutions or even a charge, I'm not even because sanction is rarely given. I mean, I think it's fair to say that sanction is rarely given by the government, at least according to most of the studies. So I think you have to sort of think about this. I also want to sort of mention it here, right, that it is the legal process in the US, for instance, in the Indian context, which always tries to give immunity to the police, right? And this is where I think, that's why I keep saying that we talk about the police, but we have to accept that even the legal system and the political mandate and society sort of is fine with the system, right? So we have to work at all these levels to make sure that the sanction provision has to be challenged if we want accountability, right? This is, and there are ways in which it can be framed to make sure that basically, it leads to a particular investigation, right?
Can I intervene?
Yes, I was going to ask you if you wanted to respond.
Yeah. So in case of death in custody, this term is very broad. Like if a person has a heart attack while he's or she's in my lockup or in my prison, it's considered death in custody. And we have to have inquest by the magistrate, and the whole procedure is followed. In case of death due to beating in custody, sanction is not required. So please note there is a difference. Any case which is an offense per se, and it's not done, beating, torturing is not a part of our duty. But if I open firing on a mob which is violent, that particular act of ordering fire is during my discharge of my duty, it would require government permission. So this is incorrect to say that government does not permit. In all cases of torture and beating, no government sanction is required. And suppose it happens, the investigation will be taken out from police thana, will be given to CID, which is considered an independent agency in police. I have seen cases, 1986 in Kolhapur, there was a death in custody due to beating, and the senior inspector of the police station and one or two more people got convicted up to the Supreme Court. So beating, torturing is not part of our duty. You do not need sanction. Now see how the point of view of a police person. I was a young ASP in Nasik in 1985. There was a false case of murder reported, just like what is happening in Bollywood case just now. It was a young unemployed boy who's committed suicide by hanging himself. But because of land dispute, the parents of that boy gave an FIR against the party with whom they had land dispute of murder. Just like what is happening in Bollywood today. Now, it was my personal investigation. I concluded it to be a false case, and the party, the accused party, the complainant party, which actually had given the false complaint, gave a complaint of, registered an FIR of illegal detention and beating, and they registered it directly through the magistrate. From 85 to year 1997, when I was district police chief of Satara. Now you can imagine for how many years, 85 to 12 years, I would go from wherever I was posted, remain present in the court like an accused, because I was accused of illegal detention and beating. In the meanwhile, I have had my 2 children. Now, every time my kids will be dragged with me to remain present, they will not go to the court, but I would stand there accused, and they will have to undertake the journey because mother is going, children are small. Now, think of this, that a police person can also be harassed by these false complaints. The case got acquitted, but for 12 years, how many times I had to stand in the court as an accused because the complainant had given a false case of murder and I had concluded it to be a false case. So academicians like Lokanita, please also study how we can be harassed and are being harassed by false complaints, false cases. I have gone through that. And I have also seen my officers being convicted because they were held responsible, held accountable, and convicted by the Session Court, High Court, Supreme Court for beating in the custody leading to death. So there are very meaningful stories, but I don't know why media and sometimes academicians also concentrate more on the negative part. And one minus point of police being a male dominated department, that men just keep quiet and suffer. In fact, having more women, I think we'll be able to project the difficulties also of our department in a we will be more articulate and be more forthcoming with the difficulties which men in our department face, and just think it's our fate and do not talk about it.
So if I can just respond,
Yes.
because, you know, she
Yes.
did ask me. Yeah. So I think, you know, I would hate to get into a one-on-one, you know, conversation on something which you have personally experienced, and I would not like to comment on that, obviously. And I do appreciate your insights. As I said, you know, talking about the police is not undifferentiated, meaning I don't think of it in a monolithic way. I tried to sort of point to that. The only two clarifications I would make, since, you know, this is sort of really something that I've studied very closely, is that, you know, it is absolutely true that if you look at NCRB reports, right, they would show deaths in custody due to a range of reasons. In fact, interestingly, until 2014, you didn't even have a category which said beating or torture or physical assault, which was added only in 2014. So you can imagine from the time that we have from 1999 to 2014, if you followed official reports, there were actually no deaths due to torture at all, right? Which I would say is very hard to believe, even from what Dr. Borwankar is saying, right? If it was true that, you know, that should have been at least a category acknowledged in the list of causes for deaths in custody. In fact, we just saw illness, suicide, you know, sort of hospitalization and so on and so forth, right? With no mention until 2014, and that too, there'll be 3-4 cases mentioned. If you just compare it, and I leave it to the audience to do so, look at the NCRB reports themselves to see how many people have been convicted for human rights violations, and also look at NHRC reports, right, which again is a quasi-state body, to see, you know, what their figures show in terms of convictions and so on. I do not doubt the fact that there have been some convictions, but I can we don't have and I think that is important to acknowledge. But for the most part, there is impunity, right? Meaning that basically the sanction provision also comes in as a way of not ensuring accountability. So we need a very serious debate on this. You know, I think that debate is welcome. If there is, you know, evidence to the contrary, I would like to know. But I do know that it's very fractional, and you can actually see it in the reports themselves that it is not acknowledged, the kind of physical assault that leads to deaths in custody. Yeah, thank you.
Taking off from Dr. Borwankar's earlier point, and something that came up in one of the questions, but I'm just going to reframe it a little to make it contextual. Something that we have not spoken about at all is the mental health of the officers carrying out either what they think is their duty or what someone else is asking them to do as their duty. And we just wanted to know if there are any provisions to ensure a mental health professional, ensure access to a mental health professional for the officers or police constabulary, because like we've said again and again that their work is stressful, it is strenuous, and it is being carried out in political situations that don't make it easy So Dr. Borwankar, we'd like to know if there are any such provisions, and Dr. Jeannie Lokanitha, we would also like to know the importance of such provisions for, like, as you would think them to be.
So first, there is no institutional provision, but all government servants, including police officers, can approach civil hospitals and treatment is free. But then, as all of us know, it's considered a stigma in India, and therefore even police officers under stress would not take help. The same report, Common Cause, says that about 36% of police officers they interviewed said that given a chance, they would like to take some other job. The job is so stressful, and that they are not happy. And when I was DCP, I had taken help of Nirmala Niketan College of Social Work and Tata Institute of Social Sciences for helping us in Dharavi and Matunga. Later on, we started in Mahim also, and Dadar also, in settling non-cognizable cases. So dispute between neighbors, dispute over water, children fighting, these kinds of issues were burdening these police stations. So we took help of Nirmala Niketan and TIS to negotiate these with the locals. And their feedback was, they used to go say twice a week, thrice a week, that when we reach more than the citizens, the community, it is your police people who wait for us. They want to unburden themselves. They want to talk. They want to tell of their issues, their domestic problems, their office related issues. So just imagine one taking help in a professional manner, going to a hospital, to a therapist, to a counselor is considered bad. But informally, this was the feedback I got from these two colleges. And yes, the fact that they are stressed is proved by the recent study also. But informally, many officers try to help their juniors. They would have confidential counseling sessions. They would organize some kind of medical help, psychiatric help. But it's still not being discussed in a formal way. It's not even being acknowledged that we need help. Civil hospitals are there. They have the facility, but very few officers use that facility.
So just to add on to that, I think, this is an important question across all professions in the Indian context, right? Including the police, right? Because they are, as one has to remind oneself, they are the only or a primary, force in the context, in any context that is also allowed to use force, right? Therefore, there's a way in which, they are in very high stress positions in terms of interaction. I also think that one of the things we have to think about is, we think about it more in terms of overwork, but I also wonder, what happens when there are people within the police force who think differently about how they should behave, right? That is also an additional, right? Because the culture is defined in a particular way, and you are aware of, sort of, let's say if they were trained in human rights, then they can see a human rights violation, right? Or the fact that their own colleagues may be biased against, the people from particular castes or gender or sexuality or religion, right? I mean, because we shouldn't think about the police as a uniform thing. So how do they deal with, sort of the everyday negotiating of that? And are there spaces that allow them to actually make interventions? I think I would add to that, right? One shouldn't, and the survey actually points to the way in which, you know, whether you're an SC/ST officer versus a woman officer and what would be the challenges. When we know that these are hierarchies that are active in Indian politics and society, we have to ask the question within the police, right? And that's something that you see in the US context also, with Black officers and women officers sort of negotiating that. I will also say that just as we are thinking about, you know, what are some of the resources available, we should also think about, are there resources available for those who are in the community who face human rights violations and the impact on them, you know, and sort of we don't have human rights survivor support services either. And so as a society, we have to think about mental health in many, many different sites. And I think that's an important part of the conversation too.
Thank you so much for all the illuminating and nuanced insights that we have been engaging with throughout the discussion. Since we're almost at the end, we would like our panelists to maybe share brief concluding remarks with our audience. Dr. Borwankar, if you might want to go ahead first.
Yeah, thanks. It's been very meaningful session, and Lokneeta, it was really good listening to you. To all the participants and audience, I would like to say that let's all, talk, write about police reforms. Whenever we meet our local councillors, MLA, MP, or any influential person, I just talked of 4 reforms: state police commission, establishment boards, separation of law and order and investigation, and police complaint authority. So let's talk about it. Wherever we can, we should involve others in our discussions. I mean, like your group, Rujita and Sanchi, can talk to other groups and build pressure, especially now elections will be around the corner. Now Bihar is going in for elections, some other states one by one. If we can build pressure for police reforms, more funding, not defunding, more funding for police to increase its manpower, equipment, infrastructure, and bring this police reforms and need for more funding in the election manifesto of different political parties. That would be a very good way out. And I would like to assure Lokneeta that by having independent police complaint authorities, that accountability which you find missing and which you have rightly highlighted, that will also be taken care of. So let's bring focus on police reforms, need for more funding, more manpower. And since politicians, the government has the ultimate not only power but also the purse, let's bring it in the election manifesto of all political parties. Thank you. Enjoyed.
So thank you so much for organizing this. I do agree that, like it was a very interesting conversation, which I learned a lot from. So I think I would say that go back to where I started, right? To sort of think about what is it that we think is the role of the police? We have to ask this central question, right? In a democratic, rule of law based society, that's a really crucial question. You always have to go back to the origins, right? And sort of then think about, is it different? Is it able to function independently of the societal hierarchies? Right? That's a very important question that you want to ask, right? But if it ends up either becoming a tool of a political party, right? Whichever political party is in government, right? Because of the way in which it's institutionalized, or it ends up embodying the prejudices and hierarchies in society, then we have to reimagine the police. then we cannot just talk about reform, right? We have to, if really, going back to Dr. Borwankar's point, that if police is to have a really good relationship with the community, we have to ask which part of the community, right? Because right now, it doesn't seem like it is able to really, represent the rights of the marginalized or those who question the state, right? And until we are able to bring that into a conversation of police, right, we won't be able to sort of think about police as, helping, right? Sort of what is it that its role in society is. So that's sort of, I think it's the overall vision that one has, right, of police, but also society and politics and other institutions that we have to ask ourselves about.
Yeah, definitely. And we believe at Academic-ish that such conversations are in fact the starting point for a lot of people to start engaging with these ideas, or start to an extent even demystifying what a certain institution or an organization does, and to actually question their relationship with it or their understanding of it. So we'd really like to thank Dr. Borwankar and Dr. Lokanitha for taking out this time and for engaging with us, for answering the questions of the participants, and for making this a reality. This was Academic-ish's first panel of sorts, where we have called a practitioner as well as a researcher to talk about something that is a real lived issue. So we really want to thank not only like our panelists definitely for joining us, but also all of our participants who have shown up here. We'll be sharing Dr. Borwankar's and Dr. Lokanitha's website details in case you want to get in touch with them or write to them. And we're also sharing Academic-ish's social media and our email ID in case you want to join our mailing list, and if you want to be a part of our weekly discussions, which we will be continuing for as long as we can, and which will be online till we can do them in person. So yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for making this happen. We will also be putting this up on YouTube. So in case somebody you want to share this with, we make the link available. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Borwankar.
Thank you.
Good night.